You know, I've been told before that I like too many types of games, and that's why I'm always getting distracted by new stuff. And just looking at the wild spread of games I've reviewed on this channel, and they might be onto something. But truthfully, I'm not that versatile. I just respond to games that want me to take their drama seriously, whether that's a horror, shooter, RPG, or action-adventure game. Sports games don't really simulate the fun of their real-life counterparts. Racing games are kind of impersonal and rubber band too much, and few things are more frustrating than a platformer mocking your 100th death with cutesy music and a giggle. That's just disrespectful. But there's one experience that helped me cross over into the world of non-action, non-edgy games, and that was 2010's Limbo, developed by Playdead for the glorious Xbox Live Arcade ecosystem that produced such bangers as Call of Juarez Gunslinger and State of Decay. Limbo wasn't like all the other puzzle platformer girls. It was a moody, gruesome, black and white tinged tale of a boy traversing a dangerous nightmare world of traps and monsters to get his sister back. The childlike purity of your quest kept me going through its twisted environments. But no platformer or puzzler ever quite hit me the same as Limbo did. At least, not until Little Nightmares. Little Nightmares came to me slowly but steadily. My wife and I dabbled with the first game a couple years ago, and Deadforge suggested I review its soundtrack back in early 2023, but it still seemed a little too cutesy for me, and I wasn't excited to dive in when I'd seen so many subreddit posts where yet another horror fan base was cooing for validation for all their wildly subjective headcanon. One Silent Hill fandom is quite enough for me already, thank you. But when the third game was announced, I had a very convenient algorithmic excuse to go back and see if I'd missed anything important. Suffice to say, several games and comic series later, and against all my preconceptions, there's not a trace, a doubt in my mind that I'm a believer. I couldn't leave Tarsier if I tried. There are a few other horror games that have this level of craftsmanship and magic to them. So today, we're going to uncover the series' humble beginnings, examine its gameplay design and art direction, and then we'll end with a whole round of theory crafting the whole series' timeline and lore, then see what the future of the franchise holds. So let's close our eyes and dream a little dream so terrible that you'll want to forget it, were it not so memorable. Let's face these little nightmares together. True to its name, the Little Nightmares series started out small, or its developer Tarsier Studios did. Tarsier started out with just 9 people in 2004. They workshopped their first puzzle platformer Tio into a game design contest winner and worked through limited funds and office space to get the game reworked into City of Metronome. Tarsier released a trailer for the game at E3 2005, but unfortunately the project never got off the ground. But a lot of the groundwork for what Little Nightmares would become had been laid. Metronome took place in a surreal clockwork city that ran on the souls of children. The monsters have elongated limbs and misshapen faces. There's a sinister playfulness to the xylophone music, and you can use your Pied Piper abilities of sound replication to either soothe some children or mind control them to sacrifice themselves to further your cause. Nearly all of these elements would resurface in Little Nightmares, but Tarsier wouldn't work on any major projects until they got hired by Sony to remake Ragdoll Kung Fu, which landed them further work on DLC packs for all 3 of Media Molecule's Little Big Planet games, and even solo developing Little Big Planet for the PS Vita. Aw, the little game on the littlest console, how cute.
Welcome to Little Big Planet.
The next big thing on Tarsier's Little Horizon was a small horror project called Hunger that bore a lot in common with their Metronome pitch. But despite having signed an exclusivity contract with Sony in 2010, Sony declined to publish Hunger because they weren't interested in small projects. Fortunately, Bandai Namco came to the rescue and even agreed to publish multiple games in the burgeoning franchise, which was quite the vote of confidence. This partnership was solidified in 2016, and soon after, the game's working title of Hunger became Little Nightmares. Perhaps a little reference to their careers being mostly defined by Little Big Planet, but who can say? And it's probably not worth asking about if you've ever seen any Tarsier employee other than David Mervick answer interview questions.
I don't really have a good answer for that, I'm sorry.
So that's what it took to make these Little Nightmares come to life, but what did it turn out to be exactly? Well, the series bears a lot in common with Limbo, being a puzzle platformer that uses realistic physics in a 2.5D playspace. There's a depth to the mostly 2D side-scrolling that means you can fall off things or go deeper into the background of an image depending on the level. Now, this is my favorite type of platformer because it's so much more immersive and realistic feeling than just being about bouncing around a cartoon level and picking up power-ups while just moving left to right. But this 2.5D design isn't just some modern technology flex. It actively contributes to the tension and dexterity requirements of Little Nightmares as a horror game. Instead of just being a reflex simulator or a game about memorizing level layouts, Little Nightmares punctuates its atmospheric walking sim sections and puzzles with obstacle course style boss encounters that encourage stealth and then often end in a final breakaway run to escape their grasp, a la the Outlast series. In fact, as much as I like the first Outlast game specifically, I think the scripted sections in both Little Nightmares games are actually far more tense and scary on average. They require so much more accuracy in your movements, the monsters chasing you are far more horrifying, and the general feeling that this world hates you and wants to swallow you up is given undeniable reality here. Okay, now that's the elevator pitch, but there is so much going on under the hood that's both subtle and clever, so let's get into it. We play as a small girl in a yellow raincoat named Raincoat? What?
What are you talking about?
We play as a small girl in a yellow raincoat named Six, who dreams of a strange, geisha-like lady and then awakes in the bowels of a ship called the Maw. Now, even this small amount of info that I just gave wasn't present in the first game proper, as most of the lore elaboration happened in the Sounds of Nightmares audio series and on the game's website. If you just fired up the game, you'd have none of this context, and might miss out on implied connections like whether it matters that the girl's name is Six and that she's 9 years old, which is just a 6 turned upside down, and things of this nature. We know nothing about Six's origins or why her dream brings her here, or the significance of her yellow raincoat other than perhaps being a Pennywise reference, and she only gets more mysterious as the game goes on. Part of the reason for all this mystery is that there's almost zero discernible text, no dialogue, and only sound effects and monster screeches. Six is a barefoot child with nothing but a lighter in a world that doesn't understand her and probably doesn't care to. And it makes the world feel like a primal, instinctual theater of the mind that doesn't care about your reason, your will, or your voice. This vessel only knows suffering and hunger, and soon, Six will know these things too. So how does the Maw play out this grand theme? Well, it's a strange vessel to understand and only slightly easier to describe. We see a lighthouse-like top to where people can enter through, but we also see large sections with walkways above that the guests enter through as well from other ships. But the majority of the vessel is submerged, as indicated by the ever-present back and forth rocking of the game's camera. And what is submerged is something that makes sense to be hidden away from the rest of the world because it lines up so well with the dictionary definition of the Maw, the jaws or throat of a voracious animal, or the mouth or gullet of a greedy person. For a game that used to be called Hunger, and for that to be such a pervasive theme not only for Six herself, but also for the guests that arrive later in the game to gorge themselves, this couldn't be a more apt name for the miserable vessel in which the game takes place. But while the visuals back up this grim outlook on the Maw, the sound design is the most immediately compelling aspect of Little Nightmares' presentation. The opening 15 minutes or so of gameplay is actually pretty uneventful, maybe even a little weak. So it's up to the score and sound effects to keep the player tense and engaged. The menu music gets you in the mood for the dark whimsy of this tale, and when you load in, a haunting tone intensifies as we move closer to the geisha in our nightmare. We don't do much at first once the game officially starts, and there's nothing of note to look at in the darkness, so our senses naturally attune themselves to the sound of the place, the pitter-patter of Six's bare feet across the presumably cold metal of the Maw. This is not only a rather affecting piece of ambient sound design, whose echo makes you feel all the more alone and exposed, but it starkly contrasts with all the shoes that you later see lying around in piles from the presumably deceased unfortunates that have met their end here already. There's a satisfying flick of her lighter illuminating the oppressive darkness, as well as the loud scrape of metal as Styx opens a hatch, and water sprays out all around you as we move through a shaft. The atmosphere is oppressive before we even get our first cinematic moment of the camera zooming out. And even then, it's the cranking and churning of machinery in the background that truly stirs me to discomfort, a feeling like the world is seething around me with idle negative energy. And it hits me even harder because it reminds me of the same menace that I hear while playing Dark Souls, Scorn, and Limbo. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Little Nightmares is the Dark Souls of puzzle platform. Now, unsurprisingly, there are no cute Mario sounds here despite this being a puzzle platformer. There's actually a disconcerting amount of realism to every effect, made all the more so by the fact that they're tied to otherwise recognizable objects that are just warped and out of proportion. Everything's a little too big for human adults if Six is a regular-sized child. And even if she's especially small in this world, then why, for instance, are the chairs so small if the man who used it to hang himself is twice the height of the chair and could never sit comfortably in it? Underscoring all of this wrongness on screen is sound designer Tobias Lilja's masterful soundscape. Now, notably, he does both sound effects and music, but they aren't implemented as separate ingredients. Lilja took special pains to never overdirect the gameplay with constant music, opting to let the ambient noise and subtle music cues ebb and flow naturally as needed. The game's sound does become its own central language, as it's the most expressive form of communication we get, because Little Nightmares has no voice acting outside of, some grunts and squeals. But not only is there no language to speak, but there's little chance of reasoning with these insatiable monsters even if they could understand you. The loss of language seems to signify the loss of innocence, reason, and love in this place. The beings here are subject to baser impulses, to primal voracious instinct, and there's no cause for higher thought. Okay, now those are the sound effects, but how does the score exactly pan out? Well, let's back up just a sec to my 2023 review of this soundtrack and have a little fun. I pretty much reviewed this sight unseen. I just watched a little bit of gameplay. I didn't really know anything about the game at the time. So let's see how my impressions of the game and my guesses of how it would turn out actually stack up, and we'll go from there. This one's got a lot of personality with plinky, mournful keys like an Addams Family soundtrack. And yes, much of the vibe here is Tim Burton-esque, with that kind of wholesomeness turned gruesomeness thing going on. You play as a ring-coated child on the run from huge people-eating monsters, and while the game goes through long stretches of silence, when the score does kick in, it makes the already terrifying scripted sequences even more unpleasant. Every possible offense to your senses is called to mind, from cannibalism, child abduction, and murder, and more. There's a little bit of Stephen King's It here. There's Sweeney Todd's meat fixation. It's just, ugh. It's not saying anything of sorts. It just seems to be more of a hellscape mirror of any and all loss of innocence. Maybe even just preying on our repulsions for shock value. But if nothing else, the music is a standalone standout. This game is a certified creep show and may be in truly bad taste to some degree, but you can't argue with how creatively awful the whole thing is with its old school instrumentation and its juxtaposition of childlike music box tones with the macabre. What a little nightmare indeed. So yeah, that's about right, and we'll go over anything I misprognosticated in the spoiler section. But for now, I just want to make sure you know just how good the soundtrack is. Tobias Lilja is masterful here, and so much of the blame for the game's effectiveness falls squarely on his shoulders. The darkly whimsical soundscape mixes beautifully with the chunky shadows and the thick haze of the film grain. Surfaces have this raised, textured feel to them as if you could reach out and grab them. There's a really effective use of depth of field and blurring to indicate distance or states of mind. But these aren't all the cinematic techniques that Tarsier had up their sleeves. So many other modern games will pause the action for extended in-game cutscenes before seamlessly blending us back into gameplay, or they ask for minimal engagement like button mashing here and there in God of War, or pushing forward on the thumbstick to make a scripted sequence progress in Hellblade. Thankfully, Tarsier avoids these pitfalls of games trying too hard to look cool without ever using the strength of the gaming medium to enhance these sequences. They understand that good gameplay and good horror requires the player to be in control and responsible for their reactions when subjected to zooms or effects on screen, for instance. Then the most basic visual effect that Tarsier employs is the maw rocking back and forth in the waves, as if rocking us to sleep so we can't wake up from this nightmare. Now, any other game or perspective would probably make this effect disorienting, but the game's intentional limitation of a 2.5D perspective that focuses on primarily left-to-right movement makes this rocking feel noticeable but natural. It's the first instance of the world kind of interacting with you, but also encouraging you to interact with it, keeping you physically and emotionally off balance under the sway of the maw. Now, Tarsier's conveyance of what to do next is also expertly communicated through the left-to-right directionality of this 2.5D world, with organic, subtle forays into that last half dimension. And because the game pairs this depth with some implacable darkness, your lighter becomes indispensable to navigation. Honestly, at times it's actually far too dark, and far too many animations require Six to put out the light to finish completing them, meaning you're having to flip it back on over and over again. But annoying as it is, it's still necessary and has a nicely textured ka-chink sound as it ignites a little spark of hope in me every time I fire it up. There are lanterns and candles throughout the game that you can light that make you feel a little saner every time you pass on that light, like you're actualizing a little passive income of hope for yourself. And to prove how vital this relief is, just take a look at sections like this early one where you're walking across an elevated pathway with no guardrails and the complete pitch blackness and can only see a couple feet in front of you, so you haltingly inch forward, afraid of falling off at every turn. It reminds me a lot of the Tomb of Giants in Dark Souls, and because Little Nightmares likes to send you to your death so often, just like Dark Souls, it's easy to feel like something could go wrong at any moment here. Now, the only criticism I have for Tarsier's use of darkness is the lack of any ambushes where they use the fixed camera or the short reach of the light to surprise you with something on the right side of the screen coming at you from the darkness or from the obscured perspective. It just kind of feels like an obvious missed opportunity to have some fun 2.5D shenanigans, but alas, it's all water under the maw. But aside from overall art direction, my favorite aspect of Tarsier's presentation is their intelligent camera work, framing of the action, and cinematic pacing. Now, the game's been called a dollhouse before, and I believe its own website even offers this definition, and its vertical slice look definitely resembles this. Six can even run into the screen and bounce off of it as if there's literally something in between her and the audience. But the game never feels flat like most side-scrollers do, because the camera is angled slightly above and down, innately granting the scenes more depth by default. It's subtle, and certainly some scenes do it better than others, but it's what makes this game a joy to look at even when you're not playing. Now, if you like that, just wait till you see all these elements in action. Let's take a look at two different sections that really show off Tarsier's cinematic intelligence and creativity. Things get rather Japanesey late game in a restaurant with sliding paper doors in which the maw's monstrous guests come to gorge themselves. But as haunting as it is to see these things stuff their faces in the muted red light, what's most unsettling is how voracious they are when they add you to the menu. You start running through an empty room, but the door slides open and guests pour onto the floor one by one and start to crawl after you in unison, the camera seeming to stretch as you travel to the right of the screen before resuming a neutral position close to you and making you feel like the game is telling you that you're close to being free and don't need to see what's behind you anymore, before subtly getting closer and closer and revealing that in fact the horde is closer than ever before and threatening to crush you beneath their weight as they crash down around you into a narrow stairwell. It's so subtle and tracks so well that it might feel obvious that this is just how you shoot this kind of thing. But this is one really good example of how Tarsier amplifies the drama of a moment that might look okay otherwise, but becomes utterly compelling when they make the camera a dynamic actor in a scene. Now, the second encounter I want to draw your attention to is a big ol' spoiler for the end of the first game, so if you need to skip this, just go to here to get to the next section. So one of the most cinematic and harrowing parts of the game is with the geisha-like lady that shows off not just how on point their grasp of depth and perspective is, but also their almost mathematical understanding of how to pace suspenseful moments. You first enter the lady's domicile where she's humming what sounds like the game's own menu theme as she looks into a broken mirror. This is unsettling enough, but even more so when you knock over a vase and instead of rushing straight for you like every other monster does, she completely disappears. We lose track of her for a bit, the soundscape holding this unrelentingly pensive note the whole time. We return to this sort of attic area with tons of mannequins that of course look similar to her with her top knot and long gown. Any horror fan worth their salt knows that we are about to get fucked with. The camera pulling diagonally as we go left and right also makes it feel like something's about to get us. But Tarsier restrains themselves, and instead of predictably animating one of the mannequins, we are given zero input that anything's happening or about to happen. Unnerved by the lack of menace, I tepidly pressed onto the back of this room, pulling myself away from the comprehension and comfort of the foreground where the camera is closest. Turns out that I actually missed an item in an adjoining room, so I had to go retrieve it, and then, as soon as I did, I heard an unsettling musical cue that registered that something had changed. Upon re-entering the mannequin room, there the lady was, accompanied by a slight cue before she fades out. Tarsier really loves using the spotlight approach to their villains, especially in Little Nightmares 2, and I think it's one of the strongest, most iconic bits of suspense they use. Then the lady rushes you from the darkness, requiring you to blast her back with the mirror. The warping sound she makes as she kills you is just violating. Then as the encounter progresses, she starts to fake you off, darting at you, then retreating back into the darkness to make you readjust again before she makes another move. It's really clever and tension-inducing. The only problem is that it, like so much of the game, requires such specific timing and sometimes luck to get past that it ruins a lot of the artistry of these moments to trial and error gameplay and frustratingly long reload times. This seems like a really good time to start talking gameplay in all of its glory and in all of its frustrations. There's a decent amount of mood-setting, walking sections punctuating the environmental puzzles, where you're managing your momentum while swinging to get across a chasm, or trying to set something in motion to give you time to get out of a room or grab a key and escape a bad guy's grasp. It's all quite intense and demanding stuff, though there are plenty of cakewalk puzzles there to kind of give you a break. Little Nightmares isn't going to win best puzzles anytime soon, but they're generally pretty fun to pull off and get the timings right for and figure out how the physics work in your favor. But where Little Nightmares separates itself from the competition is how it themes major sections of the game around huge boss characters and tasks you with solving elaborate stealth set pieces. These remind me a lot of how Outlast themes certain sections around boss characters and runs you through several different iterations based on a gimmick related to that character. Little Nightmares takes this idea and literally runs with it, often peppering boss encounters with carpet you'll need to walk on to mask your steps or beams on the ceiling to walk across without knocking anything off to alert the people below. Unfortunately, as great as these sequences are in concept, I could only bring myself to like a lot of them after I'd cleared them because of how frustrating they were. Little Nightmares has some really clunky controls and then pushes them past their limit a lot in some really exacting scripted sequences that lead to tedious trial and error runs. The problem is that even if you figure out exactly what to do through repeated failure, the finicky controls then get in your way to consistently pull off those necessary actions. There are countless examples, like how the slide move won't work half the time and Six will just bump into a wall instead of going through an opening and then she'll get caught, or how she won't grab a hold of a hook, but 1 out of like 8 times she did the exact same type of jump. The overly long reload times for all your deaths is just insult to injury too. Another frustration was how the game's camera doesn't help you properly assess the extra half dimension to your otherwise 2D play space. You can fall off anything in the game, and will often do so simply because the camera is not showing you enough of what you're walking on when up high in the environments, so it's really easy to just push a little too far left or right and fall to your death, prompting another slow reload. I just had to laugh at one of the most annoying examples of this when I started trying to cross through a slightly off-center opening onto a narrow bridge, and then the camera zooms out really fast so I couldn't orient myself, and I ended up falling off several times because I either overcorrected or couldn't correct enough and just kept walking diagonally until I fell off the bridge. Another perspective shift that felt cheap was when I jumped onto a door handle and was swinging on it into the next room, like you have 100 times. But instead of the camera following me as I went, it kind of lagged momentarily. And I let go thinking I'd land on the floor as I had, but I ended up falling to my death because there was just a chasm below it. It wasn't even a clever change-up, it was just sort of a cheesy death for shock value that you never have any gameplay reason to expect or account for. Now, these problems I'm mentioning relate more to the camera, but they're not the only thing that drove me a little crazy. There are also some really arbitrary design choices, like this encounter with the janitor. So, you get cornered in a small room and have to avoid his long arms while pulling at the crumbling cage that's the only thing holding up the door he's reaching under. So I kept dodging his hands and getting to the cage to weaken it so the door would fall on him, but I kept getting killed and I couldn't understand why. Turns out that the side I was choosing to weaken was not the side that Tarsier wanted me to start on, despite both sides being identical and the game giving me no indication they wanted me to start on one side over the other. In short, I knew exactly what to do, but was being roadblocked by the most arbitrary design. Other boss encounter frustrations include one we touched on briefly earlier with the lady. There's one really cool section where you're walking through a dark room with your lighter on when the lady snuffs it out, which is terrifying enough, but when you relight it, she appears and runs straight for you. It's deliciously scary, but the millisecond that I stood still in shock meant that I was dead and had to reload, ruining the drama of the moment. Why couldn't I have had a mere second or so of time to appreciate the scare and then run is beyond me. Later on in the section, when she's attacking you from the dark, she comes in completely unpredictable patterns, and I can tell you that from having to do this fight like 5 or 6 times. It's good that she's not predictable, but a problem arises when you have to be exactly in the center of the spotlight and turn at exactly the moment she rushes you for the mirror's animation that you're holding to rebuff her, or you'll die. And you have to do this pattern at least 4 or 5 times from random directions to pass the encounter. So there are quite a few ways to fail, and it makes the encounter feel more like luck going your way more than a satisfying mastery of the gameplay elements. And if these design choices weren't driving me a little batty already, there are a couple of glitches between this game and its DLC. In the main game, I found a weird glitch in the refrigerator section where one of the 3 hams I needed to drop down into a sausage-making machine didn't even spawn, and I couldn't figure out what in the world I was missing with this puzzle, so I had to reload. This just doesn't feel like a glitch that should still exist 7 years after release. So yeah, as much as I like Little Nightmares, and we'll get more and more into why it's so good, I gotta say the game truly awoke some juvenile gamer rage in me from time to time with its inconsistent controls, obscuring too much of my perspective when walking across narrow things, and some frustrating and arbitrary encounter design. It honestly rivaled Outlast 2 for me in terms of raw frustration and encounters that don't seem like they're balanced to be rewarding, just kind of arbitrarily difficult and requiring potentially tons of tries to get extra lucky with how the AI responds so you can make it through. It's doubly rough here because the horrifying atmosphere can easily become an unimmersively frustrating one instead, and it's never fun when a game that's designed around physics and precision and dexterity betrays its own systems by not giving you a fair chance or having an imprecise relationship between what inputs do and where they work with the assets on screen. It's rather unfortunate that the game is good enough to keep me progressing, but that its DLC seems to kind of start back over from square one with its own issues that it takes even longer to outgrow. This set of 3 episodes stars a new protagonist known as the Runaway Kid, and his story runs parallel to 6's in the main game. We essentially go the opposite direction of 6 at the beginning. We also see the janitor pop up from time to time, and see 6 in passing, which is a fun little recurring theme. The Runaway Kid also gets a flashlight, and this DLC focuses much more on his interacting with the cute little gnome characters around the mall that help him move heavy objects or can be thrown to interact with switches and such. They're a fun addition, and their implementation signals the direction the Little Nightmares series was already headed in more and more with each iteration, that of Little Big Planet style co-op. It's too bad that these gnomes AI often wigs out when they just stop moving or just won't follow you, requiring a restart. The DLC is also just about as exacting as the main game. One of the worst examples is how inconsistently a conveyor belt would let me use its momentum to jump onto a swinging handhold so it could get across a chasm. The belt would just randomly decide on my 8th attempt or so to rocket me across, even though it hadn't done anything the previous 7 times I did the exact same action. And if the controls or environmental interactions weren't dodgy enough, there are far more bugs that require restarts in the main game, like this well-documented one that happens yet again at the awful conveyor belt puzzle, where one of the gnomes will just stop helping you and stand stock still next to the conveyor belt, becoming immune to interaction, meaning you can't jostle them into doing what they should, and then you have to restart. These problems, as well as just the normal amount of trial and error deaths you run into, are made even more egregious because they're just about as slow to reload as the main game is, but they also bug out and freeze on a black screen about 90% of the time in the first episode. I had to start using a workaround I found online, which was to hit pause and then reload the previous checkpoint anytime the death animation started so that I could avoid this freeze happening. I must have done it 20 times or more, and it got really old. Again, why the fuck hasn't this been patched almost 7 years after release? There's also an elevator section that you can potentially break. Once enough gnomes are throwing coal into a furnace, it's supposed to get an elevator moving so that you can use it to progress to the next area. Unfortunately, the first time the elevator started up, I stupidly fell down the shaft and died. Upon reloading, the elevator wouldn't start up again, no matter how many gnomes were doing their job, or even when I ran into a couple of them to unstick them from their AI doing nothing again. The bug never resolved itself though, so I had to use the chapter select to skip to the next one. Fortunately, I wasn't missing much because this was close to the end of the previous chapter, but it's just ridiculous that this is a bug at all, and again, even worse that these early chapters that are going on 7 years old still have nearly game-breaking bugs. But other areas of the DLC do fare a little bit better, though they still have some problems. Puzzles.
What are you talking about?
Puzzles are much more water-based and about placement of objects to jump from rather than just tons of climbing, which was a nice change of pace. The DLC even demands some attention to detail in the later stages as you go back to the ladies' living quarters and traverse 3 different floors using the elevator system where you ferry puzzle items between the floors. There are also just some really weird kind of arbitrary solutions like this one, where you're trying to place a rolling cart at the right distance and account for how it'll roll back and forth due to the sway of the maw. But the actual solution is so specific and you can't approximate it at all, it's just dead on exact, or somehow the puzzle doesn't work at all. That's not to say that there's nothing to like here. I liked seeing Six's story from a different perspective. There's even a pretty cool set piece or two involving an underwater boss that I don't want to spoil here, but it's done well if a little finicky to pull off. The ending of the game is also quite illuminating as to the lore of Little Nightmares, but we'll have to get to that in the spoiler section. Okay, so I know that was a lot of positive criticism that eventually became a lot of complaints. So how good was Little Nightmares really? Well, despite being one of the most frustrating games I've played in recent memory, the first Little Nightmares is also one of the best because of how good the sum of its parts is. Honestly, that's kind of how Limbo felt a lot of the time, so maybe that's just the territory for physics-based horror platformers. But yeah, all of that to say, Little Nightmares quickly became one of the most memorable experiences I've had in recent memory. It's intoxicatingly dark and strange, and has some of the most suffocating atmospheres and senses of dread that I've experienced. I was always excited to see what was going to happen next, and the game's lack of a UI and its incredible art direction and camera placement made the experience relentlessly cinematic and immersive to where I wasn't as annoyed as I could be when the gameplay lagged behind. This is honestly one of the most unique horror games I've ever played, and it's funny that I almost never got to experience it, had it not been for Limbo bending my ear to games like this years ago, and the community response over the years keeping the series in my periphery, so that I couldn't ignore it any longer. Now, I did mention that we would get into spoilers, themes, and theory crafting, but that'll actually take place after we examine how Little Nightmares 2 took the series to the next level. There's a very spoilery reason why we don't have all we need to get to spoilers yet until we get past the second game, and that's all I'll say about that. So, on to the next game. So, the second game starts off similarly to the first one, with a strange dream that we awake from in a forest as a new character named Mono. Right off the bat, I can tell Tarsier paid so much attention to the right areas to improve upon. Every single aspect of the presentation and gameplay seems tighter, more focused, and less janky. The first game's graphics have held up very well because it looks like old film stock and it has a great art style, but it's definitely a little aged looking these days and often so dark it's hard to see anything. The very first playable sequence of Little Nightmares, however, relies on a liberal use of moonlight to grant ambiance, but also plenty of illumination to see traps and platform possibilities clearly and plan your strategy accordingly. In general, there's less visual variety in Little Nightmares 2, but there's also more consistency. There's a lot more emphasis on subtle color contrast and cleaner, clearer visuals so that scenes can be comprehended and appreciated more easily. The controls have also improved immensely. Mono has much more predictable momentum in his running and sliding than 6 ever did. Tarsier is no longer holding the 2.5D perspective against the player anymore either, meaning you've got invisible rails on the side of every narrow thing you walk across, so you never have to worry about falling off again. You can also just lean into objects and Mono will start pushing them versus having to grab absolutely everything and maintain this grab by holding an input. This worked in the first game because it increased tension and was a really clever way to simulate weight as you ran, but here, Mono will just put the key into his pocket and run as normal. In addition to removing some of this arduous business that you had to do just to play the game, the controls are in general much smoother with only occasional failures to launch in very specific sequences, which we'll get to later. There's just a lot of quality of life improvements in the basic gameplay that make this game a lot more easily to enjoy and replay than its predecessor. Now, these improvements aren't all that's new though. Mono can wield melee weapons that he can drag around and swing very deliberately at foes. The combat's not terrible, but it is a little annoying because your enemies can all one-hit kill you unless you hit them first, and judging depth is kind of hard in 2.5D and can often mean you swing and miss a good few times until you start trying to kite the enemy around a corner to, use it as cover while you poke at them without fear of reprisal. It's not always fun, and a section or two can be quite frustrating when one wrong move means restarting a whole section, but I think it's a good new addition in theory and wouldn't take much to improve in future installments. Similarly, the flashlight sections seem like a good idea but kinda suck in practice. You control the flashlight beam like a twin stick shooter, but the controls are a bit wobbly. This finickiness is amplified in what's otherwise one of the coolest set pieces, where you have to avoid these giant mannequins that can move in the darkness but are frozen by light. You have to run across an entire room full of these guys as they come at you from all angles, and at one crucial point, the camera's view is totally obscured by how many surround you, so you have to just sort of swivel wildly in hopes that the beam is freezing all of these mannequins coming from different angles at exactly the right time to let you pass. Doing this basically blind at one point and hoping to get lucky was not very enjoyable or fair, and seems like a bit of an unfortunate end to what is a very cool idea. Another important new gameplay feature is the inclusion of an AI control companion who's none other than Six from the first game. The Secrets of the Mod DLC had you working with AI controlled gnomes to solve a lot of the puzzles, and Little Nightmares 2 has Six occupy this role in this game. You can hold her hand and call her over to you in the one piece of linguistic voice acting the series has, and she'll often give you a boost to get to higher places. Six is unobtrusively implemented into gameplay, and always does the most useful thing first, and the game doesn't penalize you if she's out in the open during stealth sections. She's also very important to the story and to making you feel human, so her value in adding subtle emotional context to your adventure can't be understated. I appreciate that she's never a burden and facilitates fun sequences like where she tap dance on piano keys to distract a kid while you jump him from behind and take him out. The puzzles are generally better this time around too. They're more elaborate and require intuitive thinking, and they aren't as arbitrary, most of the time anyway. That's mostly just a function of the ideas being more clearly communicated to the player and being easier to pull off because the controls have improved, but that's not to say there aren't places that could have been improved just a tad. There was one chess piece puzzle that could have been so much more clever if it asked you to know how chess pieces work to set up the checkmate the puzzle was looking for, instead of just showing a diagram on the wall of where to put the pieces. So while that puzzle seemed a little too easy, another puzzle goes the opposite direction and gets a little funky. One room has you turning on the power that's electrocuting the water on the floor, so you have to turn it off, but also have to set up a shopping cart in between your side of the room and the TV at the other end that you're trying to power on. But the cart you're pushing only has one side you both grab and pull yourself to the top of in order to jump off it and get to the table where the TV is. But after taking all the time to drag it to the middle of the floor and do all the other business, you won't know that the cart isn't in the right configuration until you try and unsuccessfully pull yourself up on the side it just for some reason doesn't want you to climb up. It makes no sense why this one side isn't scalable and the other is. But I thought this was worth mentioning because it reminded me of the arbitrary do one side of the cage before the other encounter with the janitor from the first game. Okay, so that about sums up all the stuff that Mono and Six can do, but I do want to point out some of the really great set pieces that show off these brand new enemies. The teacher is one of the most chilling baddies in the whole series by far, a monster-faced lady who can snake out her neck to pursue you around corners and through vents at ease. Evading her while she monitors her classroom, ruler in hand, was extremely tense as she's off-screen quite a bit and you're kind of guessing where she is as you sneak around. Then, one of the best scenes in the game is working with Six to sneak behind her while she writes music on the piano, playing for ever so long and pausing intermittently to write notes on her sheet music. While she plays, you can sneak around and mask your footsteps, but you have to move very deliberately so that you can stop when she does, or it's curtains for you. It's a simple but very effective use of diegetic sound, and it's just unpredictable enough to get you once or twice and feel like it's happening in real time and not like you're just punking the AI. And my god, even if you can get past her, she eventually hears you and pursues you farther than she ever has through the ventilation system in one of the most pants-shitting sequences I've ever played. Actual Little Nightmare fuel indeed. And also, fuck me running. If you thought she was bad, let me introduce you to the doctor. So, while most of the inhabitants of this place appear to be made of non-organic parts, almost like they're crash test dummies, apparently they're more alive than I thought, often seeming to have their limbs systematically removed for food like in the Maw, and maybe even replaced with prosthetic limbs. Well, the mofo who's parting these guys out is the doctor, a bug-like gluttonous freak who climbs around on the ceiling. This guy gives me the worst heebie-jeebies of perhaps any character in the series, and he has to be experienced to be believed. My goodness, does Tarsier not pull any punches with the monster this time around, and fortunately, he comes to one of the most satisfying ends of any of the bad guys. But yeah, overall, the look and feel of everything isn't perhaps as immediately gripping as the first game, but it's so much more functional and fun to play, and the levels are themed much more clearly now around locations versus just the boss characters in those locations. It reminded me a lot of the Condemned series, where levels would theme themselves visually and practically around some core concept and then iterate within that concept. This continues on up to the last level, which, while not the strongest gameplay-wise, is pretty heckin' important for Little Nightmares lore nuts and is pretty impressively atmospheric as well. The strength of Little Nightmares 2 is that it's much more explicit and narratively conscious than the first game. The first game had layers for those who wanted to dig around in theorycraft, but there was a sort of dream logic that made experiencing these things just as novel as having a theory for why they were occurring. 2 introduces new metaphysical concepts and asks us to question why these kids do what they do and what, if any, grand plans the monsters of nowhere have, if they are truly monsters at all. And this is my usual moment where you can tell that I'm having to hold back quite a bit to not get into spoilers, and the lore of Little Nightmares is so cool and full of fun interpretations. Let's just get into it, shall we? We're going to map out the lore and the story of Six and Mono, and then examine whether this is merely a great piece of entertainment, or whether it's actually also a smart allegory or metaphor for some deeper things as well. Please skip to the timestamp on screen if you'd like to avoid spoilers. Okay, so for my own benefit as well as yours, I'm going to concisely pin down the chronological order of events in the Little Nightmares timeline, which will include both major games and their DLC, the mobile game Very Little Nightmares, the Sounds of Nightmare audio fiction episodes, and the 2 comic series. But this won't just be a summary, it'll be laying the groundwork for our confirmation or denial of many of the major theories out there so we can make the most sense of this intriguing world. So, the world of Little Nightmares is all about what happens when children are sucked into a horrible alternate plane called the Nowhere. In the Sounds of Nightmares audio fiction series, Otto is a counselor at an institution who's attempting to use an apparatus to monitor the dreams of his patients. One such patient is Noon, who seems to be seeing into the nowhere in her dreams, and he notes that it's essentially the next step in mankind's thinking about the nature of reality. The dreams are a way of contacting a world just beyond ours through the vehicle of the mind. The Nowhere is said to be somewhere between dreams and reality, some even postulating that its existence is predicated somewhat upon our reality, drawing from it and remixing it in some twisted ways. Now, regardless of its metaphysical origins, it's still definitely a very real place in the here and now, populated with insatiable monsters preying on each other and the children who cross over with the help of the ferryman. This crossing over seems to be the end result of various coaxings and visions from the monsters who reside here, very likely attracted to their despair and feeding off of it somehow and seeking to capitalize on it. Kind of like how the demonic creatures in Twin Peaks, like Bob, feed off the garmonbozia that generates from their victims' fear. That the children are abused or emotionally isolated in some way is in keeping with the endings of Little Nightmares 2, but also because the Sound of Nightmares protagonist Noon has a sleep disorder, a brain tumor, and is being experimented on by her counselor Otto in hopes that he can find his sister Cece, who was lost to the Nowhere years ago after reporting her own nightmares of the place. And based on Six's propensity for violence and how she sometimes even seems to enjoy it, it's possible that she's more than just having to adapt to the harsh environment she's in, but may also be mirroring some real-world abuse she suffered, or is acting out against some other slight. Now, this is just speculation, but we'll see how more likely this is than we might expect as we go on. The Nowhere residents might just be targeting paragons of innocence in hopes of corrupting them, as much as they might be trying to seek those already weakened by abuse, that are easy prey. But either way, the outcome is the same. Children like Noon are convinced through false promises by the ferryman into crossing over into this monstrous world. Giant humanoid monsters dog their every step, and various manifestations of evil like dark leeches or shadow children seem to emerge as byproducts of the twisted ecosystem of devouring each other and repurposing their remains for the engorgement of eldritch horrors. Now, we'll go into the juicier details as we go, but this is generally the trajectory of all the protagonists in the series and will help us contextualize emphasize the stakes and why these characters act the way they do the longer they're here. But generally speaking, Little Nightmares is almost always interested in the story of Six, with only one possible exception, so her perspective is what will orient our timeline around, starting with the mobile game Very Little Nightmares. Very Little Nightmares stars the girl in the yellow raincoat, who dreams she is running from someone and locks herself in a closet. She wakes up in the nest, where she runs into a dark-haired girl in a white nightgown. These two cross paths intermittently as the yellow raincoat girl evades various monstrous residents, chief among them the childlike but probably still just a monster known as the Pretender. The Pretender is vicious, and she comes after the yellow raincoat girl, who narrowly escapes thanks to the white nightgown girl dropping a boulder on the Pretender's head. But the Pretender manages to recover and knocks the girl in the yellow raincoat presumably to her death, her raincoat drifting away. We see the girl in white get on a raft and head in the same direction. Now this heavily implies that the girl in white is actually the girl we'll come to know as Six, as she's seen wearing the same white outfit in the motion comics by Plastique that show her getting captured by the hunter that sets up the beginning of Little Nightmares 2, which is shortly before she finds that yellow raincoat again. We leave Six momentarily at the beginning of Little Nightmares 2 because that game stars Mono, a boy wearing a bag over his head and a sweet trench coat, who comes to the nowhere after having his own threshold vision of a door with an eye on it, much like the watching eye doors that turn people to stone that we see all over the place in the original Little Nightmares. Notably, Noon in the Sounds of Nightmares reports that the threshold has such a door in it that she has to open in order to enter the nowhere, and Otto's apparatus even manifests a much more fleshy eye on its monitor when he's attempting to view Noon's nightmares. So clearly there's something very fundamentally important about eyes in the nowhere. But this metaphorical door, like the one in Mono's dream, will stay closed for now. Mono wakes up in the middle of a forest and makes his way to a cabin where he finds Six playing with a music box, presumably one to keep her calm and mentally occupied. He frees her, but Six takes a minute to accept his friendship. Soon though, they're working together and holding hands like proper pals who've got no one else but each other. Their new friendship is tested immediately as their escape is discovered by the hunter, who throws everything he's got at recapturing the two kids. Pretty soon it's apparent that the only way to stop him is to fight fire with fire, so Mono and Six work together to fire the shotgun they find, effectively hunting the hunter.
Gotcha, bitch!
It's worth noting here that Six seems to instinctively know what to do, rushing into action to prop up the shotgun so Mono can fire it. She's no stranger to taking extreme measures to protect herself or other kids, as her dropping a boulder on the Pretender in Very Little Nightmares showed us. She's pretty hardcore, and she seems to have either a lot on her mind from the recent trauma, or is recounting some past events that we may not be privy to as she and Mono sail away from the hunter's domain towards the city. When they arrive at shore, Six even stays behind as if reluctant. I had to call her to make her catch up to me in my game, so I don't know if she was bugging out or if it's actually a scripted thing that they do with her where she stays behind and realizes that she doesn't want to be left alone before catching up to us. This is all very interesting, and it begs the question just how much Six knows or has already seen that she's so inherently wary of the place that we're going towards, or maybe just places like it. She's clearly got trust issues, but she's also smart about how deep she's going to get into anything unless she absolutely has to. For now though, it's worth noting that as we venture into the city, just how many empty sets of clothes there are. They're classic button-downs with slacks and shoes, almost like something you'd wear to a classic corporate job. It's unclear what this means, but it suggests that there's some type of rapture event perhaps, but also something to do with suicides by the nooses that some are hanging from, or the TVs they thrust their heads through. These scenes remind me a lot of the Hanging Man from the first game. There's a bizarre amount of television sets in general just lying around in disrepair. All of them, that is, until we run into one that's burst to life with the energy of a static frequency that Mono instinctively knows to put his hand to in order to tune to it. Tarsier shows their hand a bit by popping up a prompt on screen that tells us to tune to the capital T transmission, which may have something to do with all the other TVs and what looks like some mass effect that's been had on the populace here. Now if that wasn't weird enough, Mono's sucked into the TV when he appears to tune himself to its frequency and is met with the same eye door that he saw in his threshold nightmare. As he approaches the door, he's blasted back to his previous location where Six is waiting for him, and they proceed on, the TV now dead and empty like the rest. From here, we head into the school where these awful living puppet children kidnap Six and leave Mono to fend for himself against the spine-chilling teacher. Mono fights his way through the school and rescues Six, who seems almost shocked that we came back for her. Funnily enough, when they see the kids again, which are called bullies or crackheads depending on whom you ask, Six jumps him and holds him down so Mono can crack him open with a hammer. If you don't intervene, Six will beat the living fuck out of this kid. Now, some have called this evidence that Six is an evil character, but considering that these kids have done nothing but attack them, have kidnapped her and strung her up, and we're gonna do God knows what to her, these awful doll kids had it coming. This is all self-defense or logical preventative measures. Plus, Six helps Mono get away from the teacher for good by offering her hand to him as he jumps clear of her. It's clear that she's starting to trust him as he's been very kind and considerate to her, holding her up when she falls and tending to her when she's down. Now, of course, Mono gets 0 gentleman points from me for not offering his trench coat to her in the pouring ass rain, but fortunately, what should show up shortly but the yellow raincoat from Very Little Nightmares, which Six promptly adorns herself with in order to complete her signature look, the first Little Nightmares menu theme sounding in the background. Now, this is our first major evidence inside the main 2 games that Little Nightmares 2 is indeed a prequel to the first game and happens chronologically before it. Now finally suited up, the pair heads off for the hospital. Unfortunately, while off by himself fetching a puzzle piece, Mono runs into another live TV, and he rushes to tune himself to the transmission yet again so that it stops hurting him, and he's sucked into the eye corridor again. His jaunt ends yet again with him falling out of the TV, Six right beside him. Notice that both times he's left the TV, Six has been at his side. At first I thought this was implying that they were conjoined in some way, like they were maybe 2 halves of a whole, but I think it's more likely that both times Six sees that something nefarious is happening to Mono, and she pulls him back from being subsumed by the transmission and the eye door. But it's not clear whether there's anything sinister going on here, at least not in comparison to the monsters that just outright attack. So does Six know something that we don't? Or is she still just being her usual cautious self? She noticeably backs away from Mono this time, like she's starting to get a little scared of him. It's hard to say, but it's all part of a growing theory that will of course hit its zenith by the game's conclusion, so keep this in mind. As the 2 press on through the hospital, we get one of the most confusing metaphysical suppositions thrown at us. All the bodies of the people here are mannequins made of stitching and prosthetic parts, but stitched up and treated with bandages as if they have bled or have needed replacements for missing organic limbs, despite everything being hinges and knobs and artificial materials. Were they turned from organic beings into this, or are they simply animated robots of sorts? It's unclear, as we find a bathtub filled with what looks like an actual flesh and blood person, covered in fruits or leeches or something, almost as if that's what these people once were. Now, as far as Six is concerned, they appear to be fair game as we find her trying to, either snap or hyperextend the fingers of one of these prosthetic arms at one point, almost like she's either reveling in the possible pain she could be inflicting or sort of darkly experimenting with what happens when you do certain extreme actions like this. It's kind of weird since neither this arm nor any of the others appear to have attacked her or show any signs of movement, so she really is just kind of going to town on this one. Regardless, we soon run into the horrific monstrosity that is the Doctor, who appears to be keeping some of these folks on life support, like he's possibly eating the organic parts of them and replacing them with prosthetics. This kind of reminds me of the first game where flesh is being hungered for and it's the basis of all sustenance, like in the Maw. Regardless, the Doctor has no problem eating us either, as we see in the death screens, and so Mono and Six have to trick him into entering a cremator and burning that awful piece of shit alive. Comically, or twistedly, depending on how much you want to schoolmarm, Six actually sits down and warms herself in the heat coming from the cremator's vents as the Doctor is reduced to ash inside. Again, this is totally understandable and a bit sassy from her perspective, but it does speak to the fact that Six has some dark appetites, let's say, a little vindictive side that once teased out looks for some recompense. But our attention will soon turn to the Pale City and its inhabitants for the foreseeable future. We finally see the forms of the creatures that wear the slacks and button-downs, and they belong to the male viewers, called such because of their brainless gaze at the TVs whenever they switch on. And so Mono and Six use them to distract the viewers as they make their way through some apartments. Once we reach the rooftops, we see a giant structure in the distance that looks like a radio tower, which will become very important very soon. Inside another set of apartments, we see numerous drawings of a man in a black suit and hat, and more drawings of eyes. In the next room, yet another TV draws Mono to it and we're sucked in. Six isn't able to pull him out in time like she usually does, and Mono finally gets to see what's behind door number 1. It's the very man in the drawings, a terrifying giant. Six finally pulls Mono away, but it's too late. The thin man comes out like a dapper Freddy Krueger through the TV and follows Mono and Six back into the room with the drawings. Mono hides himself well enough, but Six can't find a good spot in time, and the thin man sucks her up with static discharge and takes her away. Her glitched remains staying behind for an instant, as if part of her has been stripped away. Let's pause here really quickly to recall something that Noon's counselor Otto says in The Sounds of Nightmares.
Duality, a notion essential to psychology. We all contain a multitude of personas and change proverbial masks to match our present situations. The body is the container for this legion within, allowing us to maintain the important illusion of a singular self, the very basis of human experience. In Noon, there lies both the innocent child and the disturbed traveler. Both fight for control.
The Titan Comics series backs this idea up when it says you must remember your former life or risk losing yourself to this place. Prolonged exposure to this place seems to start decaying you in certain ways, and especially so if you make contact with one of the powerful entities here. It's all very Lovecraftian. Noon notes that the boy named Jester that she sees in her visions seems to be missing something from himself because of how long he's been here.
Other kids call me Jester because I never run out of jokes. I can tell you some along the way. A man tells his friend to stop looking for the perfect match, but he stopped. I could tell he realized that parts of him were missing, as if just being here was changing him.
I'd say this is likely what's happening to Six, as she grows a little colder and more indulgent in the violence it takes to survive here as the series wears on. But is there a point of no return where she may truly start to become a resident? Almost as if to answer that question, Mono presses on in solitude, now able to teleport between the various TV screens to progress. He even sees the viewers on top of the roof jumping for their deaths as if under the thrall of the signal tower in the distance, presumably the source of the transmission. But these are the only ones that don't give him trouble, and he soon has to escape an absolute herd of these zombie-esque viewers. Once he does, he notices that Six can be seen trying to get out of one of the TVs, but the thin man pulls her back through and then pursues Mono relentlessly. Through a series of incredibly tense chases, Mono escapes into a train station where he sees the glitched remains of Six. Is this her disturbed traveler or her innocent child like Noon had within her? I'm opting to think it's the innocent child because the glitched remains are calm and docile and seem to be trying to lead Mono on despite his exhaustion. Remember, too, that throughout Little Nightmares, we've been finding these glitched remains of other children and embracing them to dissipate them, which is much like how Six hugs gnomes in the first game, both of them being presumably the remnants of innocence of former children. This in mind, Mono reemerges on the city street, but this time he's got nowhere left to run, his innocence about to leave. As if knowing there's no other choice, no room to go, Mono removes the mask he's worn the whole game, which is a telling sign based on the game's soon-to-be-revealed ending. Then, as if guided by instinct, Mono raises his hand and starts emitting damaging frequencies to the thin man, wearing him down until he explodes into nothingness. How Mono has these powers and why is a total mystery, but perhaps his contact with the transmission, his ability to tune into it, has made him incidentally empowered by the very evil that sought to unmake him. But this was only half the battle. Mono then makes for the tower, for Six, warping the city around him to allow him passage. But once inside the surreal interior of the tower, Mono begins to follow the sound of a music box, the same tune being played by Six when she was captured back at the hunter's cabin. But this time, to Mono's horror, Six's exposure to the tower and likely the transmission has transformed her into a monstrous beast that looks very similar to the janitor from the first game. Realizing that she's being comforted but also mind-controlled by the music box, Mono does whatever he can to destroy it, which greatly enrages Six, resulting in an emotionally gut-wrenching, heart-pounding encounter. Finally, Mono is able to break Six free of this spell, but they're given no time to reunite before the walls explode into mounds of flesh and eyes which have to be what the eye doors that we see throughout this world are referencing, eyes which most likely are the ones that showed themselves to Otto on his apparatus, and which Noon saw in the Theater of the Mind episode in The Sounds of Nightmares. The flesh pursues the pair, threatening to consume them, until they finally make it to a crumbling bridge that leads to a portal out of here. But the bridge collapses beneath Mono, and he jumps into Six's grasp as he has many times, but this time, Six hesitates, and then betrays him by dropping him into the abyss below before using the portal to escape. Below, Mono awakes atop the flesh, inexplicably alive, but with little hope. He finds a chair that seems remarkably familiar and sits down as the horrifying flesh with the eyes closes in on him, twisting him, manipulating his mind. Noon describes her own encounter with the fleshy eye and sounds of nightmares, with it broadcasting its voice over a PA system much like the signal tower does the transmission in Little Nightmares 2. It reads her mind and taunts her by calling her No One, which is the taunting nickname bullies gave her in school. But this fleshy eye also seems desperate for attention, overcompensating for its own loneliness and pain. So perhaps at one point the souls of these creatures weren't so warped by rage at their own neglect as they are now. It's also a very tragic turn terrible type of trajectory if the flesh is indeed made up of all the missing flesh from these empty clothes that we see throughout the world. And that in turn were the corrupted remains of the kids who came here God knows how long ago and were corrupted by what was already here in the nowhere. Now, if this sounds a little far-fetched, it shouldn't, because we'll soon find out that that's almost exactly what happens in the Maw in the first Little Nightmares. So with all this awful context in mind, we can only imagine what venom the flesh is speaking into Mono's ears as we see years pass and his body grow thinner and taller, turning from boy into man, a very thin man. And so here he sits, waiting, calling out to his past self, for he is on the other side of the eye door in his younger self's dreams, stuck in an endless, self-perpetuating time loop of becoming his own worst enemy forever. Stuck living up to his name Mono, meaning one, single, the only, or like monophobia, the fear of being alone. Note too that when Mono and Six hide from the Thin Man sees her because she's not well hidden, sure, but he also doesn't keep looking for Mono once he's found her, leaving the area entirely. Does this mean he only ever really wanted Six? I mean, he does pursue his younger self the first time he comes out of the TV and at the end, so maybe this is overthinking his motivations. But the fact that he's content to grab Six and bring her back to the tower and placate her with the music box that he first saw her with in the hunter's cabin is telling. Maybe he really is just a tragic, wandering figure who wants Six back at all cost. And as haunting as this is, there's still some hopefulness in the underlying instinct that he has for Six. So yeah, what an ending though, right? Not only is this a great time travel twist, but this is an exceptionally good horror twist. It's incomprehensibly despairing to think of an abandoned child stuck becoming a monster for all of time, but it's also hard to imagine just how alone and helpless he must have felt, how the influence of the flesh must have warped his mind as his only remaining influence. In addition to being great genre fiction, the time loop also could represent the cycle of abuse and neglect that these children have from their parents or from other adults that just keeps going around and around, getting passed down like a demonic heritage, like original sin. But before we go full bore into the deeper applications of the Little Nightmares stories, we do have one more scene in Little Nightmares 2 that leads right into Little Nightmares, our final destination in understanding and appreciating this world. Once we see the door close on Mono as the Thin Man, the scene changes to a TV that crackles to life and out pops Six, her shadow self or Dark Six as she's commonly called, looking on. Dark Six looks down and we see a pamphlet with what we'll recognize from the first game as the top of the Maw. If the TV didn't already teleport her into the Maw, it's bound to be Six's next stop, and that means it's time for Little Nightmares, the next chapter in the series despite it being the first game. Now, to preface the beginning of Little Nightmares, we should step back just a sec to the end of Little Nightmares 2 and the nature of the signal tower. So, in Little Nightmares 2, the Thin Man can essentially ride frequencies or radio waves and teleport through the TVs around the nowhere. And we frequently think of time and space together as being sort of correlative. So if we're seeing someone travel across space and we know time is involved, who's to say there's not a source of power that can manipulate both? Our evidence beyond just the probability and congruity of the idea is that the tower seems to account for all of time, past, present, and future, and they float around in suspended gravity just like everything else does here. The suitcase on the tower that's also present in Little Nightmares' opening gameplay scene is our first clue. When Mono finds Six in the tower, she's got her suitcase with the two pictures taped inside, splayed open like a doggy bed, its springs and leathers stretched out to accompany her greatly increased stature. But in Little Nightmares' opening scene, which supposedly happens after the events of Little Nightmares 2, the suitcase is in pristine condition when Six wakes up from her nightmare inside of it. And if that wasn't weird enough, let's look at the paintings on the wall from the end of Little Nightmares 2. There's a painting of what we presume is Six eating something like she does in the first game, where she bends over and kind of gnaws down on it, as well as a painting that we see in the last area of the ladies' quarters in the first game, which is of a little girl in white. In Little Nightmares 2, this girl's been scribbled over, indicating shame or maybe even betrayal. We'll get to exactly what this could all mean once we properly introduce the lady, but the point here is that the tower is showing us events that haven't chronologically happened, at least as far as we can tell. The tower appears to have some ability to see and remix elements from all throughout time, or perhaps the entirety of the timelines are broken within the nowhere. It's also possible, too, that the theory that we mentioned earlier is that the nowhere is not a completely independent space, or if it is, a lot of what appears in it is actually drawing from the real world. And that could mean, gosh, anything from it just remixing elements that we're familiar with to actually being made up of anything that's ever happened on the other side in our reality, whether past, present, and future. So Six wakes up from said suitcase and makes her way through the Maw, the big ship that we introduced earlier. External sources to the game, like the Little Nightmares Twitter and the website, indicate that the Maw is a ship who rises from below the waters once a year, and it's become a sort of ritual feast, which might be why there's a poster or advertisement that Six sees at the end of Little Nightmares 2. Soon, Six runs across the hanged man, and it's implied that it's a suicide by hanging, what with the note on the floor and the chair. And since this is the first bad thing we see in all of the Little Nightmares series, it makes sense that Tarsier is trying to tell us how messed up this place is that someone would go to these great lengths to get out of here. But fans are quick to note that the chair isn't kicked over like it should be if it was part of the hanging, so it's more likely he was killed and it was made to look like a suicide. But why? Notably, he's the only monster-sized being here that's dead already. Did another child kill him, or did the janitor whom we run into soon kill him for some reason? Some have even noted that this hanging man could very well be the Pretender's father or caretaker, as we see in Very Little Nightmares, as there's a picture of him hanging there as well as a picture that could very well be him where he's standing next to the Pretender. Did the Pretender's death on the hanging man's watch in the Very Little Nightmares prompt his murder, possibly by the Maw's leader, the lady, or maybe by one of her underlings? Maybe, if the escaped child we read about in the lady's bio on the website is indeed Six and not the girl in yellow raincoat. But why hide the death if it's a statement killing? It's hard to say, especially since the painting in the nest indicates he's already been seen in this condition, as dead. Then again, this could also just point to how fractured time is in the nowhere that we're able to see past and present somehow. But hold that thought, because Six is really hungry and needs to eat like right now. She keels over in stomach-churning pain, some hunger, hint hint hint, tugging away at her from within. She struggles past a cafeteria-looking section and a lone child within offers her some bread to eat, which Six promptly devours. How nice of her. Perhaps there's hope yet. Six soon runs into the janitor and has to kill him by solving that goofy arbitrary cage puzzle I mentioned earlier. Good riddance, you grinning freak. His days of capturing children and wrapping them as delicacies for the Maw's kitchen are over. Unfortunately, he's but one cog in the machine, and even more dedicated servants of the Maw may still exist. After all, we see large bodies on hooks still being transported across the rails throughout the ship, and are soon reminded of our own hunger, which wasn't sated by that bread. We come upon a rat caught in a trap, and promptly relieve him of his life force in gruesome fashion. Next, we run into the twin chefs. Two monstrous brothers who obscure their faces with ill-fitting masks and who cook up the giant fish the Maw catches with the nets it drags behind it, but also the meats that were inside the hanging wrapped bodies or packages on hooks. I'm getting a bad idea about where this meat is coming from and what it took to make it. We get our answer soon as to the nature of the food chain on the Maw as we venture outside for the first time and find a cavalcade of guests filing into the Maw from another boat. Many of these engorged monsters wear ill-fitting masks just like the chefs do, and others are content to let their monstrous, saggy visages be known. Regardless, they're all headed to a very Japanese restaurant-looking area of the ship, with none other than the lady we saw in our dream looking on. These guests eat anything and everything put before them. Sausage or fish, or even the player if they're unlucky enough to get too close. Six escapes them, but not her hunger. A kindly gnome recognizes our suffering and gathers a sausage for us to eat. Now, those of you who have played the subsequent Secrets of the Maw DLC know that this is not just any gnome. This is the runaway kid who ran into the lady and was turned into this gnome. But Six, now knowing that the meats here are likely made of the children and God knows what else, opts to eat the gnome instead. Now obviously this is just sickening to think about, but it speaks to the general sense of decency that Six still has despite all she's been through. Remember, if we accept that Little Nightmares 2 happened before this game, she's already been pretty unafraid to get her hands dirty with dropping a rock on the Pretender, beating up the bullies, reveling in the Doctor's death, abandoning Mono, and killing the janitor. So as monstrous as she seems here, with the context of what the alternate option was, we see a dark, almost necessary devil's bargain with no good option that Six must choose from because the hunger within her is so strong right now. Now why it exists and why she dropped Mono is still a bit unclear to me, but we're building as to why I think that happened. Soon Six finds herself in the lady's own quarters. Cracked mirrors are everywhere, as are tons of mannequins wearing a similar hairstyle to the lady. Notably, there's a sinister mirror man in the unfinished comic book series by Titan Comics that granted kids who looked within it their deepest desire, only for it to have a monkey's paw kind of effect, where doing so always had a really bad trade-off and ended up splitting the children into two halves of themselves. This could be why the lady keeps breaking mirrors eventually, as she's caught admiring herself but knowing deep down that she's truly an ugly, awful person. Perhaps the Mirror Man broke her into two already. Either way, the lady's purpose here, according to the website, is to weave a spell that keeps the Maw's engine running. If that was all the Maw required, just sort of a magic waving of the hands, it seems unlikely that the Maw would even need to come up yearly or have this elaborate delivery and dispersal system for all the meat within it. My understanding is that the Maw requires meat to run, and that's why these unwitting guests are brought in to provide some kind of weird cycle or ritual where they feed on the meat of children, and the guests, now full of children, are repurposed into fuel for the Maw. I jumped to this conclusion because we find empty clothes and tons of shoes, like the ones they're wearing, all throughout the ship, making me think they're just getting fatted up for the kill, for the sacrifice to keep the great machine running. I'd say it's likely something similar to how the transmission works, or maybe even in concert with the transmission, because let's not forget, the TV's broadcasting weird stuff is in the first Little Nightmares. We use it to distract the janitor just like the viewers get distracted in Little Nightmares 2, although the janitor sees something that's more like a weird 1950s style homemaker commercial with a nonsense song and a woman holding a butcher's knife, as opposed to just sort of a static frequency. It's clearly not the transmission per se, but something about the TV has a similar hold on the creatures here, just like it did in the Pale City in the second game. So yeah, the lady is a bit of a witch, I'd say, and it's hard to know if she's in league with the Thin Man or the Lovecraftian fleshy eyes that seem to be at the bottom of the signal tower, or if maybe she's intentionally separated from them in her own ecosystem, feeding her own desires. But based on how many eyes are all over the place, both part of the architecture and also the doodlings on the wall, I'd still say they at least hold some sway here. Perhaps even the Maw being a Lovecraftian monster which they must endlessly devour. And from talking with the Little Nightmares community, I've heard that Little Nightmares Twitter has intimated that there aren't really big bads in the nowhere, that everyone here is in service to their deepest, darkest desires, and that means that everyone's hungry all the time in some way, and looking to feed like ravenous vampires always in need of blood. The horror is that all this pomp and circumstance is just a cover story for true evil to serve itself by serving others literally for dinner. And if we abide with my theory from earlier, one of the reasons there may not technically be any big bads is because the fleshy eyes, which you might think are like highest on the food chain, are actually just the end result of the food chain. So color me happy when Six finds an unbroken mirror and uses it to defeat the lady. The lady falls down and reveals a rather human appearance with her proportioned shoulders and hands and skin tone. Is it possible that she too was once a child here, like we've been talking about, and has just been corrupted by the nowhere like Mono was? Regardless, Six seizes the opportunity to finally sate her hunger by feeding on the lady, absorbing her dark mist powers for herself, and using them to obliterate any guest she passes as she leaves out the top of the Maw. The last we see of her, she's standing next to yet another doorway with an eye above it, as if referencing the fleshy eyes beneath the tower, and we hear a foghorn of an approaching ship who's going to find more than they bargained for with Six. This is a really intense ending and beautifully shot, but I do want to try and think about what is happening here rather than just marvel at it. For starters, why does Six have the hunger in the first place? And why does it functionally resemble the lady's vampiric soul-sucking? It's never explained in the first game, but Little Nightmares 2 seems to indicate when the Thin Man zapped her and split her soul into her physical form and then the glitch shadow version of herself, that she was left with an unfillable hole that she's constantly trying to fill. It's also possible that being turned into a monster for some time inside the signal tower may have contributed to a monstrous appetite, and may ultimately be why she decided to abandon Mono in the end. But I'm curious as to why the lady seems to have a similar power set to Six already, as we see her sucking up Six in the death screens and also transforming the runaway kid into a gnome at the end of the Secrets of the Maw DLC. My theory is that she's sucking up all the evil in any of these kids for herself, and perhaps would have turned Six into a gnome too. My reasoning is that anything shadow related seems to be either completely malignant, like the shadow children, or the shadowy leeches in the Maw, or indicating a fractured soul at the glitched remains of random kids in the second game, and eventually Six once the Thin Man zaps her. By contrast, all the gnomes you meet are very playful, innocent, and helpful, almost like they're the concentrated forms of goodness left behind when all the evil is sucked out of you. But there may still be a deeper level to who Six is or what she represents in regards to the lady that we need to talk about. As we mill about the lady's living quarters, we see several confusing paintings, which Little Nightmares 2 narrative designer David Mervick says are more like expressions of thought or memories than strict works of art. There's a picture of a girl with dark hair and a white dress that looks very much like Six did in Very Little Nightmares, only with longer hair. Possible that this is just the dress of someone from the nest, perhaps a uniform of sorts, but it's strange that this picture is all over the place in the lady's home, and many instances of it are covered, indicating shame or betrayal or generally negative feelings. Tarsier confirmed that Six and the lady aren't related, so they're not mother and daughter, but then why do we see these pictures of a six-ish looking girl all over the place, especially one where she looks like she's sort of the right-hand woman to the lady? Is Six her younger self somehow, much like how the Thin Man used to be Mono? It's very possible that the lady's sagging face is just prolonged exposure to the nowhere and that she used to look like the girl in the picture. Judging by how quickly Six was mutated while being in the tower to look like the janitor, it makes some sense that everyone here is humanoid because, well, they used to be human. That would explain why everything here operates on a familiar logic, why there are toilets, toilet paper, sinks, bathtubs, bookshelves, furniture, elevators, and all the rest, because these are merely the grown-up, twisted versions of children who were tricked into coming here just like Mono, Six, the runaway kid, and the girl in the yellow coat, or CCR. So, if the lady used to be human, then perhaps that's why all the pictures of this little girl are both covered up and sometimes open, indicating her conflicted inner love of what she used to be and her hatred of what she can't have anymore. Or maybe even her resentment that eventually she'll be replaced. Building on this thought, there's an idea out there that this girl in the picture is a type of successor to the lady, perhaps the next in line. She's wearing a white outfit just like the girl we presume is Six in the Very Little Nightmares game. The lady's website description says there's an escaped girl on the loose, but is that an escapee on the Maw or from the nest in Very Little Nightmares that seems to have technically happened before we see the things that happen on the Maw? It's likely just Six, since Very Little Nightmares released after the first game and probably wasn't being accounted for in this timeline. But I'm curious how, if Six got spirited away to this place, how she could also be said to have escaped from somewhere here, if she was originally from our reality. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that she was escaping from the Maw. Could that possibly be why the hanging man was hung? Because he was the caretaker of the pretender in that domain and Very Little Nightmares, and the yellow raincoat girl, or perhaps Six, got out under his watch? Perhaps the pretender here isn't just someone who plays pretend with dolls. Perhaps she's a fake heiress to the ladyship. I almost wondered if the nest was perhaps an academy for training children in how to become the new stewards of this world or something of that nature. Maybe they'd eventually be fed to the Maw, or maybe they would actually be prepared to be the lady and be in charge of something someday. I ask this question because there's a strange parallel between the nest and the Maw. In the Pretender's manor, we see a picture of 5 other blacked out figures and then the Pretender, almost like they're part of a group that the Pretender has some elevated status within. We see an almost identical picture with 4 other blacked out figures accompanying the lady, meaning there's 5 of them. Is Six the 6th in this line somehow? The Pretender could be construed as the 6th in her picture, as there are 5 others with her, but perhaps she's the Pretender to the throne, to the ladyship. I don't quite know what to do with this, but it's really fun to wonder about, as there are unmistakably similar motifs between the 2 places and their prominent female occupants. I couldn't quite account for Six's hunger specifically, and judging by the fact that her hunger gives her the ability to absorb the lady's powers, and the fact that Mono instinctively knew how to use frequencies to defeat his future self, I'm inclined to think that these children are gifted either when they enter or as they enter, and thus is why they're of interest to the people here. Now, the why I couldn't quite tell you, but the pattern of how these things pan out seems pretty obvious. Perhaps this is just a metaphor for all children being special in their own way, or the potential that all children have to change the world in some way through nurture, expressed here more by their nature, as they're given almost no nurture, and may have wound up here because of the lack thereof. Oh, you think this is getting heavy? Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because now we're going to ask the question, what, if anything, is Little Nightmares trying to say? Now, I'd argue that Tarsier doesn't seem to have any big agenda or something to say like so much art does these days, but I do think that Tarsier is illustrating some universal themes with some grand metaphors. Let's start with the obvious childhood point of reference that everything has. All the protagonists are children who appear to be suffering from abuse or loneliness or neglect in the real world, and all their adversaries in the nowhere either look like malformed adults or are some type of soulless shadow or doll child who's been robbed of innocence and are now full of spite. No matter where the children go, they run into systems of violence and oppression, where vicious, powerful monsters rule over their realms with an iron hand, subjugating all within. These monsters are often highly organized in their base gluttony, with systems to manage their murder and kidnapping, like the Maw's delivery system and how it fuels the engine with the meat of the guests and the children. The nest and the school and the hospital are full of people who look like they may have once been human but are now dolls, or mannequins or plaster figurines come to life. Everything's caught up fighting for who can state their lust first and most powerfully. There's also the issue of how the more the children come into contact with wickedness, the more corrupted they become themselves. I think this speaks to the cycles of abuse that get passed around and passed down, that the hurt go on to hurt others, as they say, and possibly lose themselves to addictions, to violence, and self-harm. The horrors of the nowhere that seem to visit the children worst of all also just feels like an incredibly dark representation of what it's like to grow up in general. The world is a scary place, especially when you're not being taken care of as a small, somewhat helpless being. Everything's bigger than you, more calculated than you, and more than willing to prey on you. Let's just take a look at all the shit that happened recently with Epstein's Island and the recent exposés on Dan Schneider and the child stars at Nickelodeon. There's always a predator seeking prey, and children are so often in danger of having their innocence taken away. But there's another layer too, and it's how there are other types of subjugation in our world that apply to adults too. The adult residents here smash their faces into the TV screens as the transmission is broadcast, becoming mindless thralls whenever these screens turn on. And for what? To be subservient to thoughtless, insatiable evils beneath the tower, to likely become one of their indeterminate, individuality-crushing masses of flesh? The viewer's clothing being suits and ties and slacks and briefcases feels like Tarsier playing on the monkey in a suit idea, that these are the types of people who have to fall in line and get churned up by corporate interests, the slaves to industry, the fuel by which insatiable machines churn. The longer you're in the nowhere, the longer you're exposed to the spells of the powerful that don't have your best interest in mind, the older and more decayed you get, and your only solace being endless, soulless pleasure, of escapism, of mindless entertainment, to keep you placid while you're exploited. Have you ever seen those videos of children that scream and throw tantrums whenever you take the iPad away from them? That kind of reminds me of how Six reacts to Mono when he smashes her music box. It's jolting to be taken out of a comfortable, blissful ignorance. Tarsier even said of why Mono dropped Six was that, quote, extracting someone from a fantasy could be deeply upsetting for everyone involved. The reason the Little Nightmares games are so effective even without words is that they play on such primal fears. The helplessness of childhood that we all still experience a little bit no matter how old we get, and we realize we don't have half the answers we thought our parents and the other adults did. That when we grow older, we're expected to fall in line and conform, to become useful, and sometimes that leads to inevitable exploitation and lack of autonomy. That the very things that give us escape and relief in the constant churn of life might just be convenient, flattering lies and distractions that leave us no better than before, often because they're originating from the same exploitative powers. Six's decision to drop Mono seems monstrous at first, but it's also understandable in tragic terms. She's too damaged and jaded by the older generation to trust anymore, to feel like there's any recourse when Mono takes away the one thing that made her feel happy. She wanted him to join her in her escapism, not to pull her back into harsh reality. How often do we lash out when someone brings our fragile self-image crashing down and we have no room to hide from the truth? That got a little DC Universe, but I think that's why these games are so great. There's no doubt they can be quite frustrating with their exacting trial and error gameplay, but so few experiences have felt this handcrafted, this full of artistic flair and cinematic intelligence that make them feel beautiful, repulsive, tragic, and hopeful in equal measure. Their plots and themes and symbolism don't even have to go deep. They can just appeal to the child within us and be enough. There's so much flexibility to how the world is interpreted, and it's rare to see vague fiction that doesn't need to be known in order to be enjoyed. Unlike Signalis, which I spent 3 to 4 months reading every Reddit post and watching every YouTube video of and coming up with frustrating contradictions at every turn, Little Nightmares' ambiguity actually aids it and makes it more fun because it's wholly unnecessary to actually enjoying the experience. It's just an added bonus. There's an instinctual, visual, and undeniable reality to what's going on regardless of the how and the why, and that's what's affecting, because even if you can't quite express the finer details of why it's so moving, something about the situations and the imagery are interacting with instinctual fears and emotional responses in profound ways. And now that I'm such a huge fan, I'm obviously eagerly awaiting the new entries in the series, which brings us to Little Nightmares 3. Tarsier Studios said that they were done with the Little Nightmares series, and I wish I could say confidently that they were going on to bigger and better things. But in 2019, they got bought by Amplifier Game Invest, an investment company owned by none other than... Okay, I'll let you guess. This company bought like 20 of the best franchises ever made, and then did fuck all with them, rushing out any releases that do exist and shuttering or laying off tons of people in charge of these important IPs. Oh, you guessed Satan and all the demons of hell? No, but close. It's Embracer Group.
One full quarter with a lot of changes happening. But actual operational performance, I think, is solid. We are making more money, 50% more than last year. We are generating a good cash flow of $500 million.
Fuck off! Just fuck off!
And since being bought by Embracer, Tarsier has seen a decent bit of turnover, and as of 2022, only 3 of the original 9 members remain. It's hard to say they won't be making games again, but it really feels like the end of an era. But I hope they can survive the Embrace-ocalypse and get back to doing what they do best. But of course, the reason I bring all this up is that the series is actually going to go on without them. And that's because Supermassive Games is brought in to take over full development of Little Nightmares 3. Supermassive has been known for their interactive movie-style games for a long time, most notably Until Dawn and games like The Quarry that I reviewed a while back. So while seeing them helm a full game might be a bit of a surprise, remember their ties to Tarsier's work goes all the way back to Little Big Planet, as they each contributed to that game's various DLCs. They also made the Little Nightmares 2 Enhanced Edition version that came out for the PS5, PC, and Xbox Series X, so they've got a good foothold on how the series operates already. Their cinematic acumen will also probably go a long way towards realizing what Little Nightmares games are known for, and judging by the trailer, I think the series is in good hands. I know we got hit recently with a delay into 2025, and that's too bad, but no one should complain if the game comes out smelling roses and it needed that extra time to get there. And when it does arrive, I'll be right there with you on the front lines of that positive surge. So I hope to see you there. Thanks so much for indulging my massive crush on Little Nightmares, and I'll see you around. And a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by subscribing to my Patreon. I have to thank Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, He Act Show, and M for their contributions, and a special thanks to the Nth Review and James Wyatt for subscribing to my Patreon's highest tier. If you'd like to be part of the reason this channel gets bigger and better, feel free to go over to patreon.com/highfunctioningmedium, or you can become a YouTube channel member, or if you prefer, you can donate at Ko-fi. Also check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to contribute to the channel with no cost to you. God bless you everyone, and I'll see you soon.